thanks everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us this afternoon. Scott and I call Charleston our home, and we're really excited to tell you the story of Imagine the Wall. So first, a little bit about the backstory. For those of you that have been to Charleston, you know what a lovely city it is. You probably also noticed that Charleston is very much a water city. It's surrounded by the Ashley River, the Cooper River, which makes these tidal rivers make their way out into the Charleston Harbor and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. And like many cities up and down the East Coast, Charleston's really beginning to feel the effects of sea level rise, storm surges, increased susceptibility to higher than normal tides and hurricanes. And of course, these hurricanes are becoming more frequent. And in fact, I know our families have had to evacuate Charleston 3 times in the past 5 years due to hurricane threats. So this model that you're looking at here simulates potential inundation from sea level rise in Charleston and the surrounding area. And in fact, here at 4 feet, we see that the perimeter of Charleston will be lost to these rising seas. And in fact, at 6 feet, much of the perimeter and in some cases, the interior of Charleston is going to be flooded. If we correlated this map, interestingly, to the historic shoreline and some of the tidal creek beds, we'd see a really strong correlation there. Also, storm surges are a huge threat to Charleston. As shown in this image, a Category 2 hurricane has the potential to flood a really sizable portion of Charleston downtown. You can see the areas outlined in yellow and blue, and that's from a Category 2 hurricane. Recognizing the risk associated with the storm surges, the Army Corps of Engineers, Charleston District, was authorized to commence a flood risk management study. They call this the 3x3x3 feasibility study. 3 years in the making, approximately $3 million cost, and 3 layers of coordination in order to develop this study. The authorization was focused exclusively on the protection of storm surges, taking certain sea level rise scenarios into account. So while this study was focused on storm surges, it didn't really address sea level rise or interior flooding that happens in Charleston during rainfall events. The recommendation was Alternative 3, and an Alternative 3 consists of 3 components. 1, a perimeter storm surge wall, also built to withstand earthquakes because Charleston is susceptible to earthquakes, and that's outlined in yellow on this image. Offshore wave attenuator, which is outlined in pink, which attenuates potential storm surges directly coming in from the Atlantic Ocean through the Charleston Harbor. And also some non-structural measures. Those are outlined in orange in this study area here, and they consist mostly of raising homes out of the 100-year flood, and also some flood proofing associated with that. This recommended alternative right now is estimated to cost $1.75 billion. Charleston, being the local sponsor, would have to come up with a cost share of approximately $600 million. This is another image of Charleston, and you can see outlined in red the wall that's being proposed around the perimeter of Charleston. It would basically wall off the city from the surrounding rivers. You could also see the blue trapezoidal line out in the front where White Point Garden is. That would be the wave attenuator to attenuate the waves coming in from the Atlantic Ocean. And again, the orange areas show areas where there would be non-structural flood proofing associated with those. Some facts about the wall. The wall would be approximately 7.8 miles long. It would be 12 feet above mean tide. In some cases, this is 12 feet vertical distance from the edge. In other cases, it'll be a little bit less. due to an increase in topography. There would be a requirement of 16 to 20 feet of horizontal easement in order to be able to construct the wall and maintain the wall and have the footers for the wall. This wall would then provide that storm surge protection. In 2025, it would protect against the 74-year storm event, and in 2075, it was projected to protect against the 50-year storm event. So recognizing this, the Corps of Engineers developed the Alternative 3 and put it out as a document for the public to comment on. Scott and I were working on another project at the time, and we were meeting on that project, and we started talking. This was back in late April, and we started talking about the Corps of Engineers recommendation as we were meeting on site for this new project. At the same time, we were all facing the coronavirus pandemic, and we were a little bit uncertain about our workload coming up. Obviously, there were conferences being canceled. Some of the work was slowing down or being put on temporary hold as people sort of got their footing. A lot of our travel was canceled. Obviously, we're still in some of that today, but we remember back then that it was much more uncertain. The other thing that happened last year was Charleston hosted what they called the Dutch Dialogues. And this was a workshop where a contingent from the Dutch government was brought in to talk about ways that Charleston could be more resilient to sea level rise and these storm surges and flooding. And that produced a lot of really great ideas. And one of the ideas was that we really needed to treat Charleston, we needed to treat all these issues as sort of one holistic component. And so as Scott and I started talking about this, we said, you know, we've got some idle time with some of our staff members. The Corps is looking for comments. Why don't we go out and develop a scheme as an alternative for the public to be able to look at and say, you know, there may be alternatives out there than just a wall. And while we understand that there's a lot of engineering and a lot of science that went into the wall, we also understand the unique aspects of Charleston and wanted to really be able to highlight the fact that this really needs to be incorporated into the urban fabric of Charleston, and it needs to respond to the ecological conditions surrounding Charleston. So we put together a team, and this team consisted of Biohabitats, DesignWorks. We also brought in One Architecture out of New York City. One Architecture participated in Rebuild by Design in New York City and is working on one of the projects there. We also decided we needed a coastal engineer, and ATM is a local coastal engineer in town, which we know fairly well, so we brought them into the team. Curtis Cravens, who is a part-time resident of Charleston and worked for the mayor's office in New York City on resiliency, had a lot of experience, and he joined us on the team. And then we also got a local graphic designer to help us out as well. So we quickly formed this team to put together a way to be able to respond to the Corps of Engineers proposal. So I think one of the things that about Charleston, a couple of unique things about Charleston. One, I already talked a little bit about the ecological aspects and the geomorphic aspects of Charleston. It's uniquely situated in what we call the low country, and it's the low country for a reason. Most of this area probably harbors most of the salt marsh and marsh habitat that's remaining on the East Coast. And Charleston's uniquely positioned in the way that it responds to the Atlantic Ocean and to the rivers and deltas that come out. Also, from a cultural standpoint, Charleston has a pretty storied history, and it has undergone really a renaissance in the past 30 plus years in terms of historic renovation. Many of you, again, have been to Charleston. It's often rated as one of the #1 tourist destinations in the country. But it's also, because of its low-lying nature, very susceptible to flooding. In fact, this image shows flooding in Charleston right after Hurricane Matthew. And a good portion of this flooding was both storm surge and just rain in Charleston proper. So we understand that Charleston has unique setting, has unique culture. And we wanted to make sure that whatever we came up with responded to this. One of the things that we recognized in the core study was really the core is mandated to look at the greatest benefit for the least cost. And so when we do that, and when they do that, they begin to exclude a lot of other, maybe what we would call tangible or stacked benefits associated with other measures that could provide storm surge protection. In fact, this is a little study that was undertaken by the Historic Charleston Foundation of going out and projecting what the wall would look like in certain areas of Charleston. You can see the red monolith structure there, just to get an idea of what it would block off in terms of views, both from Charleston's edge and from the water looking in as well. And really what I think we should be considering is more a holistic approach that includes the internal flooding, as well as the storm surge and sea level rise. We need to be really thinking about enhancing ecological functions. How can we develop a protection system that gives back life to the system? I think also, being urban designers, we need to think about reinforcing the urban fabric and cultural amenities that make Charleston so unique. And finally, we really need to be addressing environmental justice issues. Something that we found in the core study is lacking to some degree. So what we did was we came up with approximately 5 core principles that we worked from. First was viewing water holistically. Second was whatever we came up with really needed to be grounded in Charleston. It could be an idea from somewhere else, but we really needed to make sure that it fit within the urban fabric and cultural fabric of Charleston. We also wanted to make sure that it was aligned with the Dutch dialogues. They brought in a lot of good wisdom and a lot of public participation, and we thought the Dutch dialogues were a good segue into developing an alternative to the Corps of Engineers wall. We also thought this could really benefit by presenting it in layers. In other words, each one of the ideas could be layered in, and it almost could be thought of as a kit of parts, and really integrated in, again, to other types of capital improvement projects that are happening or could happen in Charleston. And then finally, again, it needed to be equitable in its approach. We needed to make sure that we incorporated diversity and equity in whatever we came up with. So finally, quickly, the process we went through, which was really a lot of fun. We were able to get together and do a bike tour around Charleston. And again, for those of you that have been to Charleston, you know how bikeable the city can be. And so we took a day, a nice early June day in the summer, and got our bikes and got a crew of about 11 folks using social distancing and masking up when we needed to. But we did a whole day tour around the perimeter of Charleston. And what this did was this really gave us a unique perspective on the perimeter of Charleston, how it relates back to the urban fabric of the city, and also, more importantly, how it relates to the water and the water's edge and the wetlands and ecological aspects of those components. We then also looked at precedents. There's been a lot of great work out there already. We Build by Design, the Bay Area Challenge have provided some really wonderful ideas on how to protect coastal cities, and how to use those, how can we use those ideas or components of those ideas to be thinking about the city of Charleston. Again, though, we wanted to make sure that whatever we came up with, if we used one of those ideas, it was really grounded in place for Charleston. Also, the Corps of Engineers, they have an initiative going. Todd Bridges engineering with nature. And this is being developed over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And we also wanted to make sure that we were taking advantage of what the Corps of Engineers was coming up with. And there's been a lot of great work in advancing this idea of engineering with nature. And we wanted to make sure that, again, these ideas could be used for precedence as we move forward. And then finally, we put together a workshop, and almost like a design charrette, where we all got together for a day after our bike tour and after researching some of these precedents, and really hammered out some ideas for what we could do around the perimeter of Charleston. And you'll also see the interior of Charleston. This was all to develop, again, a program or an idea or a concept that the public could understand, that they could see that there was an alternative to just the wall, and that we could also use that as our comments, our official comments that we give back or we submit to the Corps. So what we came up with is what we like to describe as a living approach. This is an image of that approach in full, showing some of the different aspects of what we're proposing. It both looks at the perimeter of Charleston, it looks at that breakwater, and in fact turning that breakwater or storm surge attenuator into a living breakwater. And it also begins to look at what we call one water. How do we integrate both the interior flooding that happens in Charleston with the storm surge protection, with potential sea level rise, all in a way to really promote and embellish life through Charleston. One of the things that we did was, as we took our bike tour around Charleston, we broke down the different perimeter of Charleston into different areas, because each one had its unique character. Some of these areas were much more historic, and really provide sort of the iconic image of Charleston, like the Battery area. Others are more of a working waterfront, like the Port and Civic District, and others are more residential, like Upper Marsh and the Ashley River Marsh. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever techniques we came up with, we really responded again to these perimeter conditions. So we came up with a slew of perimeter strategies. This idea of a horizontal levee, which I'll show you in a minute, some water control structures, elevating some of the roads. And we believe that just by elevating some of the roads a little bit, and then providing the right kind of sort of complete streetscape aspect, that would compensate for the elevation that we need to provide that protection. We're looking at living shorelines. We're looking at ways that we can raise the Battery wall and still keep it the iconic perimeter park that it is. We really re-envisioned that whole storm surge attenuator as a living breakwater archipelago. We looked at raising some of the parks and the park promenades that surround or that run parallel with some of the shorelines in Charleston. And then we also developed a quick concept for what we call the Port Canal Greenway, which I'll show you in a minute. We also went back and then we focused on water in the city. And we thought, there's creeks that have been paved over, that have been buried, and why not look at reinvigorating and re-exposing some of these corridors and make them really stormwater corridors that, again, bring these sort of green fingers within the city of Charleston. So this is an image of these different aspects of strategies that we used around Charleston, and I'll show you a couple of illustrations highlighting some of these. But again, we responded to specific characteristics associated with each one of these shorelines. And again, we really wanted to make it inclusive. We extended our perimeter strategy up toward Silver Hill Magnolia, you see in the top left over there, and over the 4 Mile community, because we wanted to make sure that everybody was protected with whatever concept that we came up with. And in fact, there were some areas where we thought the wall was actually appropriate, although we felt that the wall could be designed in a slightly different way to respond to the cultural and social aspects of Charleston. We weren't abandoning the wall altogether. We did feel in some cases it was the most appropriate choice. So one of the concepts that we came up with, and most of us know about this, is the idea of living shorelines, and how can we use oyster reefs? How can we use marshes? Or even hard infrastructure that mimics natural processes to provide aquatic habitat along some of our more urban shorelines. And while some of these techniques won't completely protect Charleston against storm surge, we believe that living shorelines should always be, wherever feasible, proposed in combination with some of those other techniques. Again, we want to make sure that we bring back as much life as possible along the urban shorelines and up along the perimeter of Charleston with any technique that we use. One idea that's being sort of pioneered out in San Francisco right now is this idea of horizontal levees. And we also, while we recognize that sea level rise will happen, we're also, some of our marshes may be susceptible to being flooded out over time. And so this idea of a horizontal levee, in this case, going all the way back on the left-hand side, there's a road there, Lockwood Drive. And the idea here, Lockwood Drive would be raised to the elevation to protect from storm surge. And then a long, gradual slope levee will be constructed all the way out to the water's edge. And in the early years, this will be used as a park, as it is now. And then as sea level rise happens, in the bottom image here, this marsh will begin to migrate upslope. And while we'll lose some of the green space here, we won't lose that living component along the shoreline edge. So we think that there are ample opportunities around Charleston to combine this idea of a raised levee and create the horizontal levee in front of it to protect Charleston, provide areas for wetlands to migrate upslope, and provide opportunities for more park and green space over the long run. So this is an adaptable strategy that we proposed. Scott, are you on?
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. You want to talk about the raised park promenade?
Yes. So one of the things that Charleston has enjoyed for many years is a very enlightened mayor, Mayor Riley. And he had a vision to create a promenade around the entire peninsula. And he's been able to do that in certain portions, this being one of them. And this is actually a photograph of the Joseph P. Riley Waterfront Park. The promenade is at elevation 9. And the elevation that we need to achieve is elevation 12. So here's an opportunity to simply raise the park up several feet and still allow people to promenade along the edge and enjoy the views out to the water and beyond. I think the next image is the Charleston Battery. You know, again, the mayor's vision for the promenade really started with the Battery. This is along the southern tip of the peninsula. And there's already work underway to raise the height of the wall along the edge. What hasn't happened is raising the path behind it. And so, you know, one of the core principles that we believe is that as we invest in the infrastructure to address storm surge and sea level rise, we should also invest in the infrastructure so that the citizens of Charleston and those that visit here can still enjoy the environment on the other side and the views that are there.
One of the other ideas we had was how to address the interior flooding in combination with the perimeter strategies. This is, as you can see in the image on the left, a street in Charleston. On the right side is the railroad yard and the port for Charleston. And so one of the ideas here is on the right-hand side, you see the wall in orange here. And again, this would be a wall, but maybe we terrace it down to provide sort of a green wall in the front facing Charleston. But we also combine it with a canal system that begins to collect and treat stormwater from the interior spaces, and then is brought back out as a channel back out into the marsh. And we also look at creating a greenway along this street. So again, opportunities to take the idea of a wall and combine it with other cultural and ecological aspects to really enhance it and provide a way for it to fit into the city of Charleston. One of my favorites is this idea of the living breakwater, and you know, in Rebuild by Design, Scape has created a really good, I think, precedent of thinking about living breakwaters up in off of Staten Island for protection of Staten Island in New York City. And we sort of took that concept and said, how can we take the wave attenuator or the surge attenuator that the Corps is proposing and doing something similar here? And in fact, what we discovered is that point off of Charleston where you just saw the battery wall in the past was called Oyster Point at one time. Obviously, the oysters are gone. That's been the perimeter has been urbanized. But we really believe that we have a chance now to recreate a habitat out here that not only protects Charleston from storm surges, but also begins to think about recreation and ecological uplift. So this is an image. By the way, One Architecture did all of these images. They did a fantastic job for us. I want to give them a shout out. Of what possibly that breakwater could look like with the battery wall on the left, this sort of shallow area in the middle, the breakwater out there that's really disguised and built in such a way where we can recreate some coastal tidal wetlands, some oyster reefs, and submerged aquatic vegetation, and even provide an opportunity to recreate on the water here. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about diversity and inclusion and equity in all this. Obviously, we did this pretty quick, and we really didn't have a chance to study that, nor were we in the right position to dictate things in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we believe that any plan going forward, while these are some good ideas, they certainly haven't been vetted with the community at large or the public at large. And we certainly didn't really have a diverse team. And we believe that anything going forward really needs to make sure that diversity is included in any kind of concepts that come up, that those concepts need to include and respond to the more marginal communities and vulnerable communities around Charleston, and that whatever strategies are developed, there's equity for everybody in those strategies. So some of the takeaways here, it takes a village. And what I mean by that is exactly what I was just talking about. You know, we did this in isolation, and we recognize we did this in isolation, but it's really going to take everybody in Charleston, the people that live, work, and play here, to really, you know, participate in this process. Scott?
So then, yeah, the next idea was, you know, often in our community, we hear that the Army Corps is going to spend $1 billion to help us fix flooding from storm surges. We would be crazy not to take advantage of that. And, you know, what we're suggesting here is to really give the community the voice to say, yes, we want your $1 billion to help us. But if you're going to build something in Charleston, it needs to be something that fits, something that's appropriate to our city. And in many ways, you know, something that doesn't just help with storm surge, but something that also creates an amenity, a piece of the public realm that can be utilized and that can enhance the lives of those that live here and those that visit here. And I think, you know, the work that we've done through Imagine the Wall has really helped give the community the voice to stand up and say, hey, let's do this the right way. Let's do the right thing for Charleston.
Yeah, I think the second takeaway is lead with what celebrates life. And by that, we mean life both from, you know, sort of an ecological perspective, but also just from, you know, cultural, social perspective in Charleston. We want to make sure, as Scott just talked about, that this design really responds to what makes Charleston so great of a place that it already is, and that it really celebrates that greatness and adds to it. We don't believe that a monolithic wall in and of itself is really the way to celebrate life. We believe that there are other methods, as we have just shown, that can do that. And then finally, I think this whole idea of finessing flexibility, and what we mean by that is that the different components that we showed may have different time periods that they can be implemented. They can be combined with other capital improvement projects. They might be able to be combined with other types of shared cost or other funding mechanisms. And so we're not just relying on one funding mechanism from one agency, and that they would have the chance to really go through a strong vetting process with the communities that will have to live with this type of perimeter protection. We know that perimeter protection is needed and is going to be required for Charleston. We just want to make sure that it's done in a smart way. Scott, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered that very well.
Good, thanks. You know, so the Corps of Engineers, they got hundreds of comments on the seawall, and they are taking those comments now, the process, and they're supposed to come out sometime in January, I believe, with a revised or updated proposal, updated alternative. So we'll see what happens then. And they will put that out for public review and comment as well. So right now we're sort of in a holding period until they go back in and revise that alternative. So I just want to again thank you all for participating today, and just give another shout out to the folks at Biohabitats and DesignWorks and One Architecture and ATM and Curtis and others that really, you know, helped out and spent a considerable amount of concentrated and focused time back in early June to put this together. And you can also find this on a website called imaginethewall.org. You'll find all these things, and we'll post this presentation up there as well if you're interested in looking at it. Thank you.
And if I can, I want to give a shout out to Keith. Keith, you really led this effort. You give me way too much credit in helping come up with the idea. It was really you. And those of you that work at Biohabitats and with Biohabitats, you should be very proud of Keith. You really, you know, pulled this together, and I will tell you, it was a pleasure to work with you and the team, and the results, I think, speak for themselves.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Also, just want to quickly mention Biohabitats puts out a newsletter called Leaf Litter, and our winter solstice issue will be on nature-based approaches to urban shoreline protection. So that'll come out December 21st or 22nd. So if you're interested, please jump back on our website and you can find it there. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
So the questions are mostly coming in through a chat box, and they're written out. And I've been reviewing some of the ones that have popped through so far, so I can share them. Let's see. So first of all, can you comment at all on the response that you've gotten, or what responses you know about from the public? Like, how was this shared, and how have people responded to it?
I think there's, and Scott, you can chime in too, there's certainly been a lot of interest. There's been a lot of different organizations around Charleston that are are looking at all these types of alternatives and sort of coming up with ideas there. I am in some ways happy, very happy and excited that we got this out. In other ways, a bit concerned that maybe there hasn't been enough leadership and enough voices out there really trying to champion alternative solutions. And I'm hoping that will change.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly when this first came out, there was a flurry of interest from a fair number of people. We got some fairly good press in the local papers, and certainly the special interest groups, the preservation community, the conservation community here in Charleston has been very interested in the work, quite amazed at what was achieved, and certainly I think very supportive of many of the ideas. So it certainly is influencing conversation. It certainly is influencing, I think, the way many important decision makers are considering the future of the Army Corps' proposal.
Yeah, I will say the Coastal Conservation League, Historic Charleston, some of the other NGOs in town are developing their sort of own initiatives and doing their own research into other alternatives as well. So that's a good sign. And, you know, hopefully as the Corps goes back and reevaluates what they're doing and comes back out with a revised alternative, that I would like to see us all sort of coalesce together to see if we can come back with a more unified response.
I think there might have been some people sort of clarifying and deepening that general question. We've also been asked about if there's been a specific response from the Army Corps itself. I think the answer to that is no. And then asking about our interactions with officials at the city, I would say that probably the primary interactions we've had have been with planning and with Mark Wilworth, the Chief Resilience Officer for the city. And so we have had some conversations, especially right around the time that it came out in the late, early fall with those folks at the city. But as Keith says, we're looking to sort of re-engage as the January commentary starts up. Another question that's coming in is a little bit of a change in topic, and the question is, can you go into a little bit more about not examining the cost of the initial setup of this sort of approach versus the seawall, but commenting on the maintenance costs and the long-term investments that you would see as sort of an annual expenditure by the city or whomever?
Yeah, I think probably there's two components to that. One, some of the ideas that we're coming up with, like raising the promenade or the battery wall path, will be an initial capital cost to do that, but the long-term operations and maintenance will be no different than what it is now, right? Other strategies like the horizontal levee, again, if that involves raising a street and reconfiguring that park to provide that slope, then again, there's a lot of upfront capital improvement costs associated with that. But when you ratchet back and think about the long-term operations and maintenance, it won't be much different than maintaining the park now and maintaining the road now. Other areas will require additional maintenance and operation, just like the wall will require maintenance and operation. And probably rightly so, some of these sort of living systems approaches will require a different type of maintenance. Some of it might be a bit more, I wouldn't say complicated, but different than maintaining a more static gray infrastructure. And so it'll take a different thought process and different way of maintaining some of these, which I think will be a great thing. I think, more and more as we begin thinking about green infrastructure and these living systems, we really need to build up the capacity within our cities and municipalities to be able to maintain and operate these systems.
All righty, we have a specific question about the insurance industry. To what degree do you think the insurance industry could be enlisted to champion such nature-based approaches to protecting Charleston?
Yeah. So Scott might be able to weigh in a little bit here. The Urban Land Institute in South Carolina just put on a 4-part series on coastal resiliency and living, what they call living on the edge, if you want to look it up. And one of the sessions was having the real estate market and insurance industry weigh in on some of the trends that they're beginning to see in terms of rising insurance costs for some of these structures and homes that are within the flood zones associated with sea level rise and these storm surges. And so I think that we'll begin to see, these, maybe there might be alternative flooding funding available to mitigate some of the rising insurance costs in the future.
Yeah, I certainly know that a lot of very smart people, finance people, are looking at that. I don't know enough about it. It's really not my arena. But from the standpoint of being able to finance infrastructure associated with resiliency, it really comes down to the insurance industry. And that seems to be the avenue that people are focused on. So I look forward to seeing what all those really smart people figure out.
Yeah, it's a good question. Here's the one about applying these a little bit more broadly. Do you know examples like this along the Gulf related to coastal barrier projects? And then she goes on to mention that the Army Corps is undergoing a major project called the Texas Coastal Study, proposing a gate system across Galveston Bay and dune systems along the coast. But I guess we're looking for other geographies for examples.
Yeah, we do. We're a little bit familiar with the Galveston example. We worked in Galveston State Park in helping Texas Fish and Wildlife, Parks and Wildlife reconstitute that park after one of the major hurricanes came through, and looking at more or less nature-based approaches there. Also are a bit familiar with the idea of beneficial use of dredge material and restoring dune systems along the coast is a sort of non-structural living system approach. So we're seeing more and more of that. Obviously in Louisiana along the coast there's some major projects going on in restoration in terms of re-diverting sediment and restoring wetlands and filling in old canals. Oil and gas canals is a way to reconnect those wetlands and make them more resilient. So there's a lot of different types of approaches happening in the Gulf and the West Coast and the East Coast. And again, I think they really need to be tailored to the specific situation, right? We need to think about the coastal processes. We need to think about geomorphology. We need to think about the ecological conditions. And then finally, we need to think about sort of the cultural context that they're in. And so each area will probably, include maybe some of the foundations of what you've seen today and others, but certainly in using it in different ways or combining it in different ways. This idea of these big breakwaters or these gates, again, that was one of the alternatives that's been talked about in Charleston, is to provide some type of gate out beyond Charleston Harbor to the Atlantic Ocean. And again, I think that, if we're relying on one system, but we're talking about resiliency, that's not a way to think about long-term resiliency. It's certainly not a way to celebrate life either. And I think that we've got a lot of other ideas and a lot of really smart people out there that come up with alternative ideas that begin to respond to, again, the unique characteristics of each site.
You know, Keith, what you just said is very interesting in the context of the Charleston study that the Army Corps did, in that they focused just on our peninsula. And, you know, the city of Charleston extends obviously well beyond the peninsula. And then we have Mount Pleasant, and we have North Charleston, we have Sullivan's Island, Isle of Palms, et cetera. And it's quite interesting and I don't know exactly how the Army Corps decided what their study area was to be, and you know, why they didn't look at anything beyond the peninsula.
Congressional authorization was just to study the peninsula. So, you know, I'm not sure what happened, you know, why that decision was made, but that was what the authorization they got from Congress. So it probably goes back to our House of Representatives and our congressmen.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, looking at it holistically, you're absolutely right. You know, this is just focused on the peninsula, where many of these other communities are beginning to feel the same type of effects and are struggling to figure out what to do. So the idea of coming up with more of a holistic solution that includes a kit of all these parts to respond to each unique condition along the shoreline is probably the way to go. But if it can be done in a more coordinated fashion, I think that would really, really help everyone.
I'm not sure if this is where you are going in part, but you know, the opportunities and the cost of nature-based solutions is probably, you know, there are very rich opportunities in where there's still a lot more space, you know, between the built infrastructure and the shore, which includes the outlying communities that you mentioned. So that's just a good point to underscore that these should be thought of more broadly.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to this idea of how the Corps, and they're mandated to do it this way. So it really is, how do we change policy? But, you know, their cost-benefit analysis is is applied in a very narrow aspect, right? And so really, you know, I think it's up to all of us to begin thinking about how can we change the idea of what a true cost-benefit analysis is. How do we take in these other factors that are not being considered?
Exactly.
So we get these stacked benefits, we get these multiple benefits out of a project. That wall will provide one benefit, and that's it, and a whole host of social and environmental costs that aren't, in some cases, taken into account. And really what we need to do is expand that idea or that definition of what a cost-benefit analysis is.
I think you're headed towards maybe the last question. I think we had originally scheduled this to sort of start to wind up around now, but we did get the inevitable question of how much does your or does our proposal cost versus you know, what the estimate is from the Army Corps.
Yeah.
How much can you do about that?
You know what? We didn't do a cost analysis. It was all we could do is to come up with this plan and get it in before the comment period ended, and we have not gone back to really evaluate costs yet. So that's something we probably should look at, but we haven't done. Again, we think that there are a lot of other funding mechanisms out there. For instance, if you're going to raise a road, can you get DOT funding to help with some of that if you're turning it into a complete street, right? If you're going to redevelop Brittle Bank Park along there, can you do it in a way that provides that horizontal levee? So we believe that there are a lot of other funding mechanisms, probably federal, state, and NGO funding mechanisms that can contribute to all this. It doesn't just have to come out of one pot. That's not to say that we should ignore or turn down the Corps of Engineers proposal, that maybe we start with that and figure out how we can take that and combine these other funding mechanisms and expand this whole concept of what this wall is and what it means to the city of Charleston.
One thing I can positively say is that our benefits far exceed the benefits of the Army Corps wall.
Well, I'm here to announce that we are just about out of time, but before I close up, I did want to give a little plug for the upcoming issue of Leaf Litter, because there was a question about the insurance industry, and our issue will feature an interview with Dr. Michael Beck from the Institute of Marine Sciences at UC Santa Cruz, and he is doing some really interesting work and collaborating with the global insurance industry. And in fact, the global insurer AXA just established a chair there and over $1 million of funding for Dr. Beck's research. So I think there is exciting progress happening there. So I look forward to sharing that with all of you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jessica, for a great presentation today. And thank you, all of you, for joining us. I know this pandemic has been a giant pause for all of us. There's been a lot of pain in that pause, but it's also created space for perspective and reflection and new ways of thinking about things. And I hope you saw that reflected today.